Okay, so welcome to this video where we're going to add tons of functionality, basically the functionality for the whole app. So it's going to be amazing, so stick around to the end for the grand finale where we have everything actually working and you have your first Django CRUD app running. So we're going to be able to create recipes, update recipes, view recipes, delete recipes, which are known as the CRUD functionality, create, read, update, delete. We will also introduce class-based views, which are classes that cover common use cases. So far we've only been using functions for views. These are classes that speed up development a lot for common use cases. And now I want to say there's not a right or wrong using functions or classes. You can accomplish the same thing. It's just for some uses, classes make it much quicker. So we'll go over those and the differences. And so let's jump right into it. Make sure your editor's open, you're in the right directory, and you have your virtual environment running. So if you're not sure how to do that, you can run this command right here if you're on Windows, env scripts activate, and if you're on a Mac, I think it's source env/scripts/activate. Should be like that. But we have ours running. So the first thing that we're going to do is transform our current homepage view. So if we go into our views.py and look at our current home view, we're going to transform this function into a class. And right now all it does is gets all the recipes and lists them. And there's a class that's built in called the ListView that does this out of the box. So we'll go up to the top, and I like to separate the imports. So up at the third-party imports, we'll go from Django.views.generic import list view, and then below this current homepage function view we'll say class, and then we'll say recipe list view. You can name it whatever you want. This is just kind of a convention, and it inherits from the ListView class. And now the only thing that we have to provide is the model, and then it's just models dot whatever the model that we want to list is, recipe. So we save that, and there we go. That's all we have to do for that class. Now the next thing we want to do is update the URL. So we'll go into urls.py, and here we have the views.home, but we'll use views.recipe_list_view. And now this path function takes a function as this parameter. So for these classes with Django, you have to use this as_view method that they come with and invoke that, and we can keep that the same. And now it should all be connected, so we can try and run the server. So python manage.py run server, and if we go to localhost 8000, I'll bring this over into the view, and it should be loading, and it gives us an error. Template does not exist. And that's because when we were making this function view, there's a few things that we did that when you use a class views, it expects to be different. So for example, here you can see template does not exist at recipes_list.html. So with the classes out of the box, there's some naming conventions for things that you have to follow. So it wants us to say this template is recipe_list. And there's a few other things that we have to either change or update, but we'll just update them in our current class. So we can go back to our view, and we can pass create a few other variables that we can override. So this one can be template_name equals, and then recipes/home.html, just like right here when we were trying to render it. So if we save that and go back and refresh this, now we don't get that error, but we don't get anything showing up. And that's because there's one other thing that we have to update, which is that object, which was the recipes getting displayed in the template. So by default, if we go back, by default, it's just called object. So we can either update the template and change it to be object, or we can override what that context variable is going to be called in this view. And so instead of going through that whole template and changing every single instance of recipe to object, we'll just override it right here. So we'll say context underscore object underscore name equals, and then it is called recipes is what we called it in the template. So if we save that, and now if we go back and refresh it, voila, it's showing all of our recipes. So if we look at the code, it really is the same amount of lines of code, but that's because we had to overrule the template name and the context object name. If we were just using out-of-the-box functionality, then it really could have just been one line of code. So now we know how classes work coming from a functional view. From here on out, we'll just be going with the default settings and naming the templates the default name and default objects. So we'll see how quick it can be to add a lot more functionality. Okay, so now let's set up the detail view for each individual recipe so we can see a page and details about each individual recipe. So at the top, next to ListView, we'll also import a class called DetailView. And then below the recipe list view, we can create another class, detail list or recipe detail view that inherits from detail view. And all we have to do here is pass in the model, and this will be models.recipe. Now if we save that, that's all configured. The next thing we want to do is configure the route in the URL. So if we go to the URL, we can actually just shift alt down arrow to duplicate this one and call this recipe slash, and now this is where we have to touch on dynamic URLs, because we're going to have to pass in an integer and name it the PK, primary key. So by default, when using these classes, it expects to get this PK, this primary key of the recipe that we're going to be displaying, and you can specify what type this will be so that when we go recipe /1, that'll register okay, but if you go recipe / the word hello, that will know that it's not an integer. And then for the view, we want to pass that recipe detail view .as view, and we can change it from recipes home to recipes detail. Save that. And now we want to create the template. So we'll use the expected notation for the naming convention, which is something like app /model _ view type. So in this case, it's going to be recipes / recipe detail.html, like that. So we can go into our templates, recipes, create a new file called recipe _ detail.html. And we can just copy the code from the home page because it's pretty similar. Copy the home page code over. We will remove the for loop. So we'll remove the for and the end for. Then we'll also update every instance of recipe. So if you highlight recipe and click Control D, it'll select the next occurrences of that word. So we can do all of those and type object because that's what it's expecting by default. So that'll be whatever object gets passed. And then we can add right up here, we can change this instead of recipes app home, we can say recipe number, and we can do object.id like so. And we can remove this link. And if we save that and we bring it up in the browser, we should be able to see something now. If we go to recipe-1, boom, now we see the first recipe and its details. Amazing. And so you could see when we just use classes out of the box and use the default settings, it's super quick, super easy to get set up and functioning. Okay, so now let's quickly update the home page so that the links go to the detail page. So if we go back into the code and we go into the home page And right here where it's this link, let's just add this URL. So URL recipes -detail, and then when it expects a dynamic value, we just pass that in right here. So we'll access that recipe object.pk and then close off this tag. Save that. If we go back to the app, go back home and click view recipe, it works. And if we go to something that doesn't exist, like 44, we'll get this 404 not found error, which is exactly what we want, because by default it would just pass in that 44 and just display a blank page, but we want it to only show pages where there's actually content. So that's a good functionality to have. So beautiful. Okay, so now that we can list the recipes and view a recipe detail, we want to actually let users create new recipes. So let's go back to the code, and in the view, let's first import a class CreateView. Then below this DetailView, we will class recipe CreateView that inherits from the CreateView. And what we have to pass here is model equals models.recipe. And we have to specify the fields. And so we could say all to get all fields, but we don't want to have the author of the recipe display, because we want that to just be the logged in user. So we'll cover that in a second, but we can also pass in a list and pass in title and description, like so. Save that. And now if we go to the urls.py, we can duplicate this home view and call it recipe/create, and the view will be the recipe create view, and it'll be recipes create. And now the naming convention for this template, so we're going to create the template for this create view. This template gets used by the create view and the update view, so its naming convention is model_form, so recipes_form. So we'll create a new file, and it'll be recipe_form.html, and we're actually just going to copy over the register template from the user's register. So in the user's app, under templates, under register, we're just going to grab this file because it's going to be pretty similar. So we're going to grab that. We can close out the user's app, close out that, go back to the recipe form and paste that in. We can lower this terminal a bit so we can see more stuff. And now what we're going to change is we're just going to change the legend to be add recipe. If we can spell recipe, add recipe, we're going to have this value be save, and instead of already having an account, we'll just make this a cancel button if they don't want to add the recipe, and we'll link this back to the URL recipes home. So it'll just take them back to the home page if they don't want to create one. And I think that's it for the create. Now if we go back and view the app and we go to recipe-create, it should be working. Did we name it something else? Nope. And now you can see we already get this form with the title and the description and the save. So if we try and add a test item, so we could say assemble ingredients and click save. Oh, we get this error here, integrity error, not null constraint recipes author.author ID. And that's because we're not telling it who the author should be. And so we can override a method on the class. So if we go back to the code here and go back to the view, we can override the form valid method. So we can say def form_valid, take self and form, and we could say form.instance, so the instance of this form, and the author attribute, the author input data, equals self, and self has a request, the request object, and the request has the user. So we can say the author is the user, and then the thing, all that we have to do now is return super.form_valid, passing in this form. So basically we're just saying, overriding the form valid method to assign the form instance author field, the request.user, and then we're running form.form valid, basically. So we'll save that, and we can try and run this again. So if we go back and we click save, value error, cannot assign simple lazy object. Recipe author must be a user instance. Well, this is because we're not logged in. So if we log in here, and I always have trouble remembering these passwords, but I think I should be able to, hopefully. Let's see. Hopefully you're able to as well. So, nope, it looks like I'm not. That's not it. No, isn't it? Is it DJ Vac? Maybe it's, there we go. We got it. So hopefully you were able to remember yours too. Now if you go to recipe/create, now we actually have a signed in user, so we should be able to add something. We can just say click in assemble. Now if we click save, it gives us this URL to redirect, URL to redirect to. So there's just one thing we have to do is say, where do we go after we successfully create this object? So for this create class, this CreateView class, we need to add a, so now we need to tell it where to go once it successfully creates the object, and we can either do that by telling it on the view, or we could just update the model. So if we go back in the model and go to our recipe, we can add a get absolute URL, which takes self, and it just returns reverse, which we'll have to import. And so what do we want to look up? Recipes detail, and it takes keyword arguments, and we pass the pk as self.pk, and this needs to be a string since it's a key, and so it's giving us an error here, so we need to import reverse. So from Django.urls import reverse, and that should take care of that. So now we have an absolute URL that can be found for each of these objects. So if we go back to recipes create and we click save, beautiful. Now it takes us to the actual object that was created, and you can override these different settings in case you want to have it redirect to the home page or some other page, but I think this makes sense. So now if we go back, we can see this hamburger, and it actually created the hamburger object before when we didn't have a URL for it to redirect to, but we just got that error because it didn't have anywhere to go. So it created the object, but then this was the one that just created that we just viewed. So if we can view this recipe, it's recipe number 4, and this recipe down here is recipe number 5. So they're both different instances or different objects in the database. And now the final thing we want to do for this create view is block it to only logged in users, because we don't want someone who's not logged in to be able to create something, because then we'll get an error because there won't be an author. And so we're going to use a mixin, which is basically just another class that we can inherit from. So we'll go back to the view, go back to the top, and this time we'll import from Django.contrib.auth.mixins import login required mixin, like that. And then we will just grab this, and to the left of the create view, we'll paste that in. So it has to be to the left, so it gets inherited first, and then the create view. And that should be good enough. So now if we go back to the recipes app and we go recipes recipe/create. We're able to view it because we're logged in. If we log out and go back to recipe/create, it'll tell us we need to log in first. So beautiful. So now I guess we can just log back in. For the remainder, we're going to have to be logged in mostly, so we'll just log in and a little more practice to remember your password. And so that's the CreateView. And so that'll actually be it for this part 1 of 2 of these CRUD operations. So in the next ones, we will add update and details and deleting and finish all of the operations off. But so far we've made a lot of progress, and so you should see on this screen now a button to go to part 2. So you can go there and finish up the app and wrap everything up.